Hello and welcome to another slightly geeky ranking video. What does he mean by slightly, you may ask? So this video is rather simple. It's about comics again, but this time about my favorite comics characters. Which protagonists do I hold most dear, at least right now? I mean, ask me in 5 years and it might be completely different. Now, I need to clarify one thing about this. I am not a sophisticated comics connoisseur. When it comes to comics or so-called graphic novels, I'm a complete primitive and pretty much a simpleton. I don't want to read comics with symbolic value or high concept art house comics with a social agenda, which are often very sloppy in style, I might add, but that's a different story. And honestly, I don't want to read comics made of speaking animals. And I really don't care about American superhero stuff. Generally speaking, when I read comics, I'm only interested in two motifs, two aspects of this art form, and that is escapism and or nostalgia. So it is not surprising that almost everything I like comes from European comics with a strong emphasis on the Franco-Belgish scene. And interestingly, I've assembled a list of 10 of my favorite comics characters, and interestingly, 5 of them are male and 5 of them are female, which is completely coincidental, but I thought it's rather interesting. So, let's begin. Number 10. Jean Van Damme and Philippe Aymon, Shania Rivkas, aka Lady S. A classic Jean Van Damme creation, beautifully realized by the outstanding Philippe Aymon. At the beginning, Shania is a young girl, a street criminal, stealing from tourists in southern France, when she manages to get adopted by a wealthy American couple, where the husband is a politician and a diplomat. Shania will soon become interesting to certain people who will groom and train her to become a spy. This is a wonderful, adventurous romp, mostly set in Europe and North America, with great action and some atmospheric landscape by Philippe Aymon. Lady S is the opposite of a Mary Sue. She has to grow into her abilities as this highly trained operative. At the same time, what makes her intriguing is her checkered past and her Baltic background, and therefore this effort to create her own identity and finding her role in the world. Lady S is certainly nothing for intellectuals, but as far the trope of a hot chick turning super spy is concerned, this is the right stuff to go for. Lady S started to appear in 2004 and is still being continued, despite the fact that Jean Van Damme left the project after the 10th issue. These integral volumes here contain the first 13 stories, but there are already 4 more in French. I'm definitely looking forward to those. Number 9, Frank Biancarelli and Louis Trondheim, Carmela Krim. So this collaboration between Biancarelli and Trondheim has yielded 2 stories up until now. Probably not enough to make the main protagonist appear in my top 10, but I just find her so interesting and fascinating. Carmela Krim is a middle-aged woman who once was an inspector in the police, but got fired over some scandal. She works now as a private investigator in Marseille in the south of France. She has an Arabic background, or to be precise, a Maghrebinian background, which often plays a role in those stories. I just like her dry, sometimes sardonic approach. Carmela is a very well fleshed out character who is able to function amongst the elites of the city, but also in its criminal underbelly. And the city of Marseille is a character in this story, and you experience Marseille in all the social strata. But as a comics, Carmela Krim is also an ensemble piece, and that is a strong part of the charm. She meets a guy who is like a former bodyguard who becomes her assistant and investigator, and the daughter of her former colleague at the police force constantly wants to work for her and doesn't take no for an answer. Number 8. Jan van Nam and Philippe Franck, Largo Winch. Another Jan van Nam creation. And yes, I get it that Van Nam has often been criticized to be rather shallow, not to mention rather old-fashioned, misogynistic, and that may apply here in the adventures of Largo Winch probably more than anywhere else. So this is the odd one in my collection, because just purely based on the style of the story I should hate and reject it. It is a stark contradiction to my anti-monetarist and anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist leanings, so I guess it would qualify as a guilty pleasure, because this series takes place in the world of the rich and powerful, so basically people I'm always interested in exterminating. Anyway, Largo Winch is not your typical billionaire. He's just a guy who was actually a bit of a deadbeat, but suddenly inherited this American business empire. So I guess the story also asks question. You may hate billionaires the same way like I do, but what would we do if we suddenly became ultra rich? Immediately turn into assholes? Probably. But there is always the myth of the one who can take over large capital without becoming corrupted by it. But don't worry, these stories are mostly about action, adventure, exotic foreign places, organized crime. The portrayal of women might be called problematic, but I would say that comes from the fact that James Bond was probably a strong influence here. A tiny little less realistic than Philippe Aimant, with a slight hint of caricature. But overall, Franck is quite amazing when it comes to perspective and extravagant buildings. Also, all of these stories are slightly interwoven, which give it a somewhat a larger story arc in the background. Number 7. Léo, Rodolphe and Bertrand Marchal, Cathy Austin. If there is one king of escapistic comics, then it's the Brazilian graphic artist and writer Luis Eduardo de Oliveira, better known as Léo. And he has created two completely different series or universes, which actually both feature in my list here. And Léo is really great at creating female characters, while his biggest strength actually lies with the creation of purely escapistic worlds. He has an incredible fantasy and creativity. Now, as a graphic artist, as a drawer, I am probably not his biggest fan. I find his style good, albeit somewhat a little anemic. Actually, his style kind of reminds me of these illustrations that you can find inside of publications printed by the Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, I'm a little mean here. But when Bertrand Marchal took over the drawing of the Cathy Austin adventures, it really added a lot to the visual quality. These stories take place in the mid to late 1940s, so Germany has just lost the war and Europe is quite destroyed. Cathy Austin is a British investigator working for the MI5, so there's a certain post-war spy novel atmosphere here, combined with amazing elements of science fiction and horror, but most of all exotic adventure. This is what it is all about here, pure escapism. I can barely imagine a better series to forget the world outside for an hour or so and to get lost in some big adventure abroad. The entire vibe of these stories is very much in the spirit of pulp magazines, or as the Germans call it, Schundromane, but with an incredible charm. There are 4 seasons in existence now, although the 4th season is still ongoing, so this may take a year or so until the current one is finished. The first season was called Kenya, the second Namibia, and the third was the outstanding Amazonia, but the 4th one is called Scotland. But the names are pretty self-explanatory. It is always 5 volumes per season, unless one day you'll get some big bulky integral edition with the whole season packed in. Number 6. Greg Rucka and Steve Lieber, Carrie Statko. So this is actually the only American comic book and character here in my list. I've always loved US Marshal Carrie Statko, who is the main protagonist of the 2 Whiteout comics. Greg Rucka and Steve Lieber created 2 volumes with this character. I've always hoped for a 3rd one. I know they both don't dislike Whiteout. Whiteout has been made into a proper, expensive action-adventure movie. Now, the movie pretty much bombed, but as a matter of fact, it was not that bad. But here's my problem with the movie. Warner Brothers could not resist, and they had to cast Kate Beckinsale in the lead as Carrie Statko. But that's horrible. The one thing that is super important about Statko in the original comics is the fact that she does not look like Kate Beckinsale, that she does not look like a perfume advertising model. That's the entire premise of the character. But they could not resist. If you wanted to cast Carrie Statko properly, then maybe Shailene Woodley would have been a better choice. Although I think the casting closest to the original would have been maybe Elizabeth Moss. But anyway, that's neither here or there, since I really don't care about comics made into movies. Both Whiteout stories take place in the Antarctica. The first one is basically a crime detective story, beautifully heightened by the dangerous, unusual environment of a huge polar station. The second story, called Melt, feels more like an action story and a thriller type of drama. In my little list here, this is the only comics that is unconditionally black and white and will never be colorized. Steve Lieber is amazing with screen tone. I love screen tone in comics and halftone effects, and he is a virtuoso with those. Carrie Statko is a very fascinating woman and not without a problematic past, but completely driven by her determination, while at the same time being vulnerable and literally badly wounded. These two books are just outstanding. Number 5. Leo, Kim Keller. Kim Keller is a creation of the before-mentioned Leo. This is the other universe he has created, once again an exciting vehicle for pure escapism, this time deep in space in this giant science fiction saga. The interesting thing about Kim Keller is that at the beginning she is a rather obnoxious teenager, but while these huge adventures take place, she's growing older and older, so her personal arc is always part of the overall drama. This story is about the human race somewhat 100 years from now while trying to colonize space, but actually succeeding only on a planet in the orbit of the star Aldebaran, which is the name of the first season of this series. The second season is called Betelgeuse, named after the star in the constellation Orion, and the third season, for example, takes place on a rather dangerous planet orbiting Antares. So Kim Keller starts as a slightly obnoxious character, but at the same time you pity her because she is thrown into very dire circumstances. But she becomes this glorious character, not only fighting monstrous creatures, but most of all fighting for her self-determination and for her freedom, since there are far too many people interested in controlling her, since she has a secret of cosmic proportions. Number 4. Möbius, Major Grubert. Of all the comic characters in my list, this one is the most abstract, surreal, and the most ethereal. And there are reasons for that. On one hand, Möbius was stoned a lot while drawing these comics, and on the other hand, the entire concept of those stories, particularly the airtight garage, have been set up as this stream of consciousness. And that is something that is highly unusual in the world of comics, simply because the process of creating comics is far too intricate and too much of a grind. Creating good-looking comics is a grind. It takes time. It is work. But Möbius had this ability and this talent to draw really good while being shockingly fast. So he could actually allow himself to draw something that was not prepared. No script, no planning, just following your creative instincts. It is a unique approach for an art form that is usually such a time-consuming process. So that makes it quite unique. First, Möbius did only 2 pages at a time in this style. Those 2 black and white pages then appeared in the Metal Hurlant magazine. But who is this Major Grubert? And I intentionally used the German pronunciation of the title Major, simply because I believe that is how Möbius intended it. It's like Grubert's Germanic helmet hinting at the German colonies in East Africa. So, Mayo Grubert is this rather mysterious guy who travels through space-time and across multiple dimensions. He has a spaceship called the Siguri. But there is no way to read this with the rational approach. You will only be confused and disappointed. You need to go with the flow and just enjoy the beauty of these drawings. Of course, it raises the question, why does it make Mayo Grubert into one of my favorite characters? I guess it is because he is a great foil. But foil for what? Well, I suppose for everything you want him to be. It is a very abstract world and certainly a strong exception in my list here. But I would say most of the time Mayo Grubert stands for a certain stoic attitude, and that is maybe something that can actually be quite inspiring, even though I wonder if this makes any sense to you. Now we are closing in on my top 3 favorite comic characters. Probably not too much surprise here. Number 3, Claude Auclair, Simon Dufleuve. So, Auclair started to draw the Simon comics at the beginning of the 70s, and by doing so he was really far ahead of other artists. I mean, today the post-apocalyptic wanderer is a comics trope repeated hundreds of times. But back in the day this motif existed only in novels and slowly began to be examined in movies. But Auclair created this fully developed post-apocalyptic Europe with new cultures and civilizations emerging. It is not a wasteland. He rightly shows the real effects of the end of times by mostly showing the nature taking back the land. So these are actually very pastoral stories. Simon is an upstanding man in search of the human soul. He is not willing to give humanity up. And he is someone who still remembers the time before as a kid. And his father was somehow entangled in the bad things that happened, which is a subliminal theme in these stories. Auclair was an ardent leftist and socialist, which made him maybe a little bit exotic in the Franco-Belgian comic scene of those years, which I would not describe as particularly right-wing, but certainly in a very consumer-friendly, capitalistic spirit, often influenced either by American capitalism or consumerism or by the Christian right, although that barely played a role at the beginning of the 70s. That's why, mostly through Michel Régnier, Simon Dufleuve started to be first released in the Tintin magazine, which would probably not have happened 10 or 15 years earlier when Hergé was still the editor-in-chief of the magazine. So that's interesting. Now, Simon Dufleuve might be a do-gooder. He's probably more like Kwai Chang Caine in the US series Kung Fu. Although I think Auclair based him on the character Jeremiah Johnson, played by Robert Redford, the movie by Sidney Pollack that came out a year earlier. And Simon is not a naive positivist and certainly not a passive guy. He's a fighter and he's a survivalist who is highly capable. There is a lot of action in these stories, but also a lot of meditation about the conditio humana, about the human condition. And there are some amazing female characters created by Auclair. There is certainly a sense of alienation and detachment in those stories as a consequence of the human population being reduced to a microscopic amount. So loneliness is a major theme here, but also the rediscovery of our humanity far from the commercial travesty that we call humanity now, which is almost exclusively all lies and drivel. So I find Simon Dufleuve today even more relevant than back in the day. And he certainly is a rather strong and good example of a true role model. I'm actually kind of surprised that Hollywood still have not bought the rights of this and made a franchise out of it. But I'm very glad about that, because Hollywood needs to burn down first. Trust me on that. Number 2, Hergé, Captain Haddock. Now this is an interesting twist, because while I was thinking about this list and naturally assumed that Tintin, the energetic reporter, will be in my top 10 list, I kind of realized that actually I'm more in the Haddock camp. Captain Haddock reflects much more how I feel about the world, how the world itches and rubs me constantly the wrong way, and his choleric outbursts, while being absurd, are something I can very much identify with. I'm not the one to be proud of that, but it is nice that the rather mature and older Hergé understood this feeling so well. There is just this beautiful discrepancy about the peaceful, contemplative way the captain imagines the world and wishes the world to be, and the state the world is actually in. This discrepancy is the source of all the friction that makes Captain Haddock such a wonderful character. It is probably the only comic character that I know that I can fully identify with on every level. But let's not forget that he is also an extremely courageous man, willing to die for his friends. There is nothing postmodern about him. Yes, he's the comic relief of the stories and often very clumsy, but once he enters his own habitat, which is the deck of a ship, everything changes. And I kinda like all things maritime. But like Haddock, I've spent a lot of effort to reach a certain seclusion, so I don't need to experience my tantrums. But the world is sticky and intrusive and drags you always back into the light. In Haddock's case, into the adventure, mostly facilitated by Tintin. Number 1, Hugo Pratt, Juan Diaz-Canales and Rubén Pejero, Corto Maltese. And finally, my favorite comic character of all times. Nothing surprising here. The gypsy captain and the eternal traveler, a man of his time, representing all the nostalgic yen for an era long gone. An era when a journey was still a journey and traveling actually meant something, unlike today. Corto Maltese is certainly an enigmatic, almost mysterious person. Maybe not in the same sense as Major Grubert, but Hugo Pratt originally created Corto Maltese as this soldier of fortune, basically a pirate trying to make his luck in the southern seas. But over time his personality expanded in the same way Hugo Pratt's interests were always expanding and branching out. So Corto Maltese is someone who is in search of the old mysteries and the old mythical themes tying the world together. So there is also often mysticism, and we get dragged into the world of alchemists and spiritists. There is always this notion that Corto Maltese is just a grave robber, and there is certainly an element of that. But he is far from being a greedy man, on the contrary. His constant search for secrets and mysteries reveal an inner sense of purpose. He is this fascinating mixture of Lord Byron and Indiana Jones, but he has also this laconic and very stoic approach towards life and towards other people. There is a beautifully apolitical demeanor about him that is actually rare to find in this world. But Corto Maltese, above all, represents the human experience beyond the intellectual discourse. He's the man of the deed. He's there in the middle of it all, taking part. They sometimes say the journey is the reward. It was never more true than in this character. Corto Maltese is the eternal traveler. So, this was my ranking list of my 10 favorite comics characters or protagonists, and I hope this was in any way interesting for you. I wish you a very nice Sunday, and see you next time.